Welcome back to this week's episode of the Breaking Bias podcast. I'm Molly, and I'm joined by my incredible co-host, Dr. Obbs. How's it going? What's up? It has been a minute. We had the triple header and a bunch of stuff going on. How are you?
Doing great, Molly. It was an exciting weekend. We had, like you said, 3 straight races in a row, and now I think we have a 3-week break
We
to
do
the last
have a
3.
3-week break, and unless
Yeah,
you're me, and we have the last NASCAR race of the year this weekend, but then that means I'm in my off season finally, so it's very exciting. We're nearing the home stretch, so it'll be a couple quiet weeks, and then Las Vegas, which will be fun. But there's been
there's
a lot
light at
going
the
on.
end of the tunnel for you there,
Yes,
Molly.
there
And speaking of
is.
NASCAR, we had a really exciting weekend in Martinsville, didn't we?
Yeah, it was. So it was the last cutoff before the playoffs, and it was what I would kind of honestly consider like a classic of a Martinsville race. It was a very, very good short track race. They had a tire that was throwing rubber everywhere. Like I love seeing cars covered in rubber at the end of the race. So that was really cool. But then there was kind of a lot of late race drama. I actually fell asleep because if you can't hear, I have a cold. And I fell asleep a little bit while watching it and woke up to catch kind of the last half of the last stage play out where a lot of the drama happened. And it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, Molly, you've been educating me on
Yeah.
NASCAR, and I've grown to love the playoff system. Actually, I think it's really cool the way that it
I
works, and you've got the point systems. And
and the
I know I was texting
elimination.
you during this race and the previous
Yeah.
race about, well, what does so and so have to do to get above the cut line,
Yep.
and they were trying to get down from 8 to 4. Is that
Yes,
right?
correct.
Yeah, I'm a Denny Hamlin fan, so I was like hoping Denny would be able to get it, but he didn't have
Yeah,
the pace. But the end of the race
it
was
did
the
get a little crazy.
really cool part because you had guys that were really pushing to try to get their points totals to a point to where it would be
Yeah.
just above the cut line. We
Yeah,
had
and
some
that's
interesting
where
races. Yeah.
this is where NASCAR kind of differs from Formula One, and we won't dwell too long on NASCAR for our Formula One listeners, but in NASCAR, team orders are not allowed under any circumstances. So whereas like in Brazil over the weekend, we saw Oscar swap the place for Lando for points, that's not allowed in NASCAR. Anything that is akin to manufacturers, alliances, and team orders are like fully banned. And so as the race began to play out, there was a driver in a Chevrolet, William Byron, who was tied with a Toyota driver trying to get in on points for the final spot in the playoffs. And
Mhm.
there was some questionable radio from other Chevrolet drivers that indicate that maybe there was some manufacturer's orders at play with they were saying that is the one car, another Chevy car, is their crew chief on board with the plan? Do they know what's going on? And
Mhm.
these two cars proceeded to run interference, as it appeared, behind the car that was trying to get in, preventing him from getting past because that means he would have lost a point. You gain a point in NASCAR for every car you pass, but then you lose a point for every time you get past. So they were
Yeah.
trying to help protect him. But then as that was playing out, another driver, the 20 car who he was fighting for that spot, who's in a Toyota, Christopher Bell, rode the wall on like the last lap or close to the last lap, just like Ross Chastain did 2 years ago in the Hail Melon, where basically keep the throttle to the floor, throw the car into the fence, ride along the wall because you're not scrubbing speed into the corner at that point. It's a better line. And as long as you know you're going to make it, you're going to carry much more speed through the corner and gain spots. And Christopher Bell rode the wall. It's open to interpretation, but it was determined by NASCAR that he did. And so after the race ended, there was this like 15-minute window of nobody knew who was in aside from the winner, Ryan Blaney,
Mhm.
joining his teammate in the final four. And so there was this kind of like, do we know what's going on? Are they looking at the two cars that were interfering from the same manufacturer? Are they looking at the 20 car riding the wall? What are they looking at? And then they came down and said the 20 car had a safety violation. He rode the wall, which after the Hail Melon happened, NASCAR came down and said, you know what, this isn't kosher. This cannot happen. It's not okay. And like I get where they were coming from when they ruled that. It wasn't like a whole no fun league kind of thing. So I get why they ruled it like they did back then, and we've not really seen anybody try it, but Christopher Bell did in a moment of desperation, I think, personally, in that moment, to try and get spots and carry some more speed. And they ultimately ruled that it was illegal, and Christopher Bell was out, and William Byron was in at that point on points.
Yeah. And the interesting part, like you said, is that the manufacturers will align themselves to do things, whether blatantly sort of saying it over the radio via the spotters or the crew chiefs,
Mm-hmm.
or, kind of take matters into their own hands and use code words to slow
Yes,
down.
code
I
words
think,
are huge in NASCAR.
yeah, yeah. And honestly, I think they use code words well, they definitely use code words in Formula One.
Oh,
I mean, when
totally.
they're talking about different strategies and things like that.
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah. There's regulations around that, though. Like, there's not really in NASCAR.
yeah, yeah. But the interesting thing was that, like, Bubba Wallace, who is a
Toyota driver.
2311 driver,
Toyota.
who yep, Toyota. And then you've got Denny Hamlin, who's part owner, 2311, also Toyota driver. And then you've got Christopher Bell, who's Toyota driver. So you
Mm-hmm.
saw Bubba Wallace slow way down, and
Yeah.
he said there was something wrong with his car.
Yes.
So now NASCAR is inspecting his car to see if there was actually
Yep.
something wrong with his car.
Yeah.
But when he slowed down and then Christopher Bell kind of passed him, he got up high. And in Martinsville, I think one of the coolest things that, if any of our listeners want to go look, if you just Google like tire debris or marbles in Martinsville, you see these really cool pictures after the race where, like, up high on the high line, it's just like covered in these like marbles, which is
Yeah.
just the little bits of rubber.
There's not
And
a high line, really.
yeah. Yeah. And so when you get up high into the marbles, it's like, we talked about this before in Formula One,
Yes,
because the
we have.
same thing happens, is that you get into the marbles and the tire debris, and it's like you're on marbles, you're on
Mm-hmm.
ice. And he
Yes.
kind of flew up into the wall, but the problem was, when he went up into the wall, he just he punched the throttle. So then it was
Yep.
like right there.
He's
You
riding
look
them
at the
off.
telemetry, you can see
Yeah.
it's like wall ride. So
Yep. Yeah, I think that'll be interesting too, because then Elliot Sawyer, one of the high up officials at NASCAR, came out and said, we weren't looking at the Chevrolet stuff. We weren't looking at the Toyota stuff, but we're going to look into it now. And so Tuesday is like the penalty day for NASCAR. So by the time this episode is out, we'll probably learn more about what's happened. And that's kind of the beauty of NASCAR, is they have access to all of this stuff. They can review it. Those cars are probably back at R&D, being further torn down and looked at. They'll do some stuff at the track, but they might take it to R&D and do some more. So we'll know more probably after this episode comes out. But it's interesting, and I was kind of talking about this with some other friends. It's fully shenanigans from both manufacturers, a little bit of, I'm going to say it, fuckery. And I think it is a byproduct of the system, and it's kind of what the playoffs have become, unfortunately. And it's been very blatant at places like Daytona and the plate tracks, where you need to work together and you have to kind of stay aligned with the group. It's been very, very blatant there for a very, very long time. And I think NASCAR's kind of just let it fly, where they just kind of understand that's the name of plate racing and it's not really been a problem. But this is like the first that I can recall in a long time at not a Daytona or a Talladega that something like this with a manufacturer has really kind of shenanigans out. So I think it's interesting, and it'll be one to, I think, kind of watch if you're into NASCAR, or curious about it, because there's a lot of layers to it, and it could impact maybe the playoff structure, how they regulate playoffs. Like I said, I personally feel, I'm taking my I work with the series hat off. I think it's a byproduct of the system that they've created, personally. And I think the officiating, they did the right thing, because that was deciding who was going into the playoffs. And I say they did the right thing, not by who they let in, but taking the time they did to review it, because then they're going to send that person the championship where it's anybody's game. And had that person then won the championship, then what?
yeah.
So I think they kind of did the best that they could then in making the right and most sound decision based on telemetry. Like, I wasn't in the room, but I think that the fact that we were in this situation is just a byproduct of the playoff system that NASCAR's created.
Yeah, and for anybody that wants to hear more about it, I can recommend Actions Detrimental
Yes.
podcast with Denny Hamlin. He talks all about it, makes some
Mhm.
very good points about
Yeah.
why, teams that are under kind of the manufacturer umbrella have a push to take care
To
of the
do stuff.
manufacturer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was really interesting. And then also kind of he gives a bit of a take on, from the Toyota standpoint, have they ever been told to do something, for the other Toyotas? Definitely check that out. But I think for our Formula One fan base,
Yes.
this is kind of like, everybody complains about Racing Bulls and Red Bull and kind of the affiliation and things like that. This is sort of like Max Verstappen, in the last race of the season, Abu Dhabi. They're tied on points. Lando Norris is behind Max. All he has to do is pass Max, and Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda get behind Max and go double wide and don't let Lando pass.
And it would be like their lap down kind of thing, ignoring green flags and all of that.
Exactly.
So, or it's kind of the situation we were in mathematically a little bit ago, where Daniel Ricciardo took the fastest lap at Singapore, and if you did the math between Max and Lando proceeded to win all of the races or score, I think it was like 2 or 3 places higher than Max for the rest of the races of the year, they would go into Abu Dhabi tied on points. However, or no, they wouldn't go into Abu Dhabi tied on points. They would go into the last race of the year, and Max would win by 1 point theoretically, because Daniel Ricciardo took the fastest lap point that Lando needed to tie, and then it would have been a finishing position race, I think is how that tiebreaker works. So it's exactly like that, where you have an aligned team, a sister team, running interference for your main team.
And
so
sorry.
Yeah, I think we're going the same place. You're the segue king. Go for it.
Yeah, speaking of Formula One, I mean, that was great. Highly recommend. There's one more, just one more race, or there's a couple more races in NASCAR?
There is only one more race left this weekend in NASCAR. So by the time this episode is out, I'm going to plug this really fast. By the time this episode is out, it is the championship weekend in NASCAR. It's probably going to be a drama-filled, crazy great race, especially depending on how the week plays out. So I highly recommend that you tune in to that race, because basically the top 4 go into that race completely even on points. They reset the points, and it literally becomes who finishes in the best place. So it's going to be great.
And it's not just those 4 that are racing, right?
All other 30 cars
everybody
are on
else
track.
too are on the track. So if anybody has a grudge or anybody's pissed off about something, they can screw over driver who's in the final.
Guys get tangled up in wrecks. You can also have a driver win who's not in the playoffs, and then you have a guy celebrating a race win, and then you have a guy who maybe finished second who was in the championship fight, and then you've got 2 celebrations going on. So there's a lot of fun layers to it, especially this weekend. So I highly recommend, if you need a racing fix, to tune into that this weekend. And I think you were about to segue us, because we're talking a lot about race officiating, and I think that that's a great segue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about stewarding, race officiating,
Yeah.
Formula One, across multiple races here. I mean, most recently Mexico and Brazil, we had our own stewarding drama. So let's start with Mexico.
Yes,
the Mexican Grand Prix.
A lot of stuff happened in Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, is Ferrari back? They had a 1-2, and then Carlos won. Like, what?
And before that, Coda.
What? Yeah.
1-2, and then in Mexico they were 1-3, but still it was like, okay, Ferrari resurgence. The their latest upgrade kit seems to be doing the trick. But Mexico was really interesting from the standpoint that, Ferrari didn't bring anything to Mexico.
No.
But McLaren did. They brought a brand new floor.
Yes.
And this was, you remember, for the longest time, like, McLaren had not touched their floor.
Yeah.
I think maybe since Miami or something.
That's correct. They've not touched the floor since Miami, really. And they've done everything else to the car.
Yeah. So it's been a while, and everybody else has been kind of falling off the track because they mess with the floor.
Yeah.
And, what do they say? F around and find out. I mean, it's like, that some of the teams had done that with their floors, and McLaren hadn't done it. So it was like, what's going to happen with McLaren? They're bringing a new floor.
Yeah.
It
How's
seemed
it
to.
gonna
Did it work? Did
go?
it not work? I don't know. Lando was P2. What do you think, Molly?
I think it worked. I maybe question that it didn't give them as much as they hoped. Because I
Yeah.
don't think they took it back off. That's usually the big indicator for me, is if it comes back off or they split the cars in setup. And so I don't think I ever saw that floor come off. So I think it's doing whatever they want it to do. And maybe it was just a general like efficiency improvement kind of thing where it's like not going to be a big hitter, but it helps them further downstream or just kind of kicks some air out somewhere. Like it's subtle. You know what I'm saying? Like it might not actually equal something major on track, but it improves the overall setup window or flexibility, ride heights, and stuff like that with the car that maybe does help them in getting extra out of it that they didn't before. So I think that it's worked. It didn't come off the car. That's usually my big indicator is there's a fall off or it comes off one of the cars and they split a setup. So I think it's working as intended, which is good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm kind of the mind that maybe we are getting to that theoretical kind of ceiling or that performance
Yeah.
limit. I mean,
The
I
like
hate.
convergence of everything where everybody's kind of coming
Yeah,
to the same answer in the
and
same lap times.
and I'm gonna look like a complete fool. And next year for 2025, they're a second and a
Who
half
knows?
faster across every track. That
Hey.
they'll find something, but maybe for this year with the amount of cap
Yeah.
space that's left and aerodynamic development, tokens that are left, maybe
Yeah.
they're all just kind of eking out very small marginal things towards the end of
Yeah,
the
and
season, possibly.
I think they've kind of lucked out with their cost cap too, because like crash damage rolls into your cap versus teams that have had higher crash totals that are then having to trade off upgrades versus operational costs potentially. Like, if I don't take this upgrade, can I even fly to a race or can I even do this at
Hmm.
a race? I think that they've been very lucky with their crash damage. It's been relatively low this year, last I was aware. So I
Yeah.
think it's helped enable them. Like, I'd have to pull up Destructors Championship, Checo's leading, obviously, but um, I think that they have been very lucky under cost cap too. That's enabled them to do so much of this and to have this like crazy upgrade cycle that's allowed them to bring a floor so late, in my opinion, and do all of these other mass packages that they have. Whereas if you look at like the upgrade cadence for some of the other teams, I think it's apparent they've been maybe hit by cost cap and kind of some crash damage totals.
Yeah, and I think it was Rosario, Juliana. I can't remember.
Giuliano,
Juliana. Yeah,
Duquesa.
yeah. So I think he does a really good job on X of like showing side by sides of like
Oh yeah,
upgrade updates and things like that. And so I was like studying the McLaren edge wing because that's one of the things
yeah,
you can see, and it does affect the floor performance. So usually with a floor update, you'll get like an edge wing update, and it was so subtle what they did, but it just goes to show that that's kind of where we're at right now. Like
yeah,
I think even if you could see under the cars, it's probably like a little tweak of a profile here and
yeah.
there. It's not major sweeping
No,
big changes.
I don't think
So
so.
they're just trying to eke out bits and bits of performance here and there.
Yeah, and I think the math was what? It was a half a tenth off of signs in the race total with the
Yeah.
floor. So I think that says it's likely a tweak as well. It's not anything major in terms of expecting multiple tenths. I just lost my train of thought. Shit. That's what it is. In the whole, like, how much downforce is too much downforce, and
Yeah.
you then hit the crossover point of too much, it's bad now, right? I
Hmm.
think that there was a lot of caution around doing that. So taking a giant swing at a floor would have
Yeah.
been, I think, scary. And so I think the fact that it's a subtle thing also kind of ties into that they know that they're really efficient and producing downforce really well where they want it, all of that, and then are making these subtle tweaks to just do that better and not
Hmm.
approach that like too much downforce is bad downforce at that point, like we
Yeah.
saw Red Bull maybe struggle with in some of the other teams. So I think that that's part of that. Like, we've hit the bad downforce point with these floors, and
Yes.
it's actually
We've
there is a
fallen
point where
into
too
the
much.
downforce trap. right, as we
Yes,
say.
yes, the downforce trap.
And Max himself had a really tricky weekend. Poor Checo as well had a really
Yeah,
rough weekend. Uh, but Max, suffering from a lot of issues, I think during FP1, right,
yeah,
which dropped him way back
yeah,
in the running, and then was able to put it in P2 in pole in qualifying. Sorry, not pole,
yes.
in qualifying, but then dropped off completely after that.
Yeah,
He had the tussle with Norris, so let's
he
talk about
did.
that.
Oh, the tussle with Norris.
Where do you stand on
I
all this? Is it just
um
racing, or is this like, I don't
yes.
know?
It's just racing, but my stance, and a lot of people are probably going to hate me for this, and I don't care. It's Max's IQ in that moment, the one where Lando ultimately got penalized. Was that in Coda or was that in Mexico where he got that second track limits in
Lando
turn
got
8?
penalized in Coda. Max got penalized twice in
That's right.
Mexico.
Okay. So I'm going to start with Coda, and it's going to lead me to
It
Mexico.
Yeah, it's absolutely a story. Like, it is a
So,
development arc. So cook, sister.
so, what happened in Coda with Max and Lando where this is like the tussle part 1? What ultimately forced Lando into getting the penalty, to me, is purely Max's racing IQ. And I think someone made the comment, like Jensen made the comment after the race in the broadcast to Christian's face, and was like, your driver's really good at understanding the regulations. And that's exactly what you sometimes have to do. What I think he did was he knew that if he bumped Lando wide, Lando was going to it wasn't intentional, but he was trying to force the mistake with Lando, if that makes sense, because he knows how Lando races. He knows Lando. So he can anticipate the reaction. In my opinion, this is like, I'm not speaking for Max in any way. I just think because we kind of know how these guys are wired a little bit and how things kind of play out, they're looking for the human factor. They know how he's potentially going to react. They've been racing together for so long that he probably knew that Lando was going to make a mistake if he pushed him. And so he did stick himself in there to get the corner. And I think it forced the mistake on Lando that if Lando had just backed out and not tried to take the corner and exceeded the track limits, he wouldn't have gotten the penalty, because he could have crossed Max up in the next corner and actually gotten it back, or at least fought for
Yeah.
it back. I think it was kind of short-sighted that Lando stayed aside him, and that I think that's what Max knew. And Max did that on purpose to try and force that mistake, because it was like, okay, he's gonna back out, is maybe what he was thinking. And then when he didn't, or he expected him to do that and he knew it would be a track limits kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of pieces to it, but I think Max knew, and he was trying to force the mistake. And that's what you have to do at this competition level. And people can be mad at me for saying that, but when you're competing at this high of a level and everybody is so close and the margins are so tight, you like, forcing a mistake is part of the game. And so
Yeah.
I think that's what he tried to do in Coda, and it worked. Personally, Mexico gets a
A little bit more
rough.
spicy.
It does. Turn 4 from Max, that penalty, I think it was like debatable. Turn 8, fully deserved, because you could see that that was in pure anger. Like,
Yeah, frustration.
you could tell it was Max driving angry. You could see the steering jog a little bit there, and so that was a little bit of his temper flaring. So like, turn 8 deserved, because he was driving a little mad and pure frustrated. Turn 4, that first one with Lando, a little debatable, and I think it's what led him to get the double penalty, because he was mad about that and he let it get to him a little bit and it caused him to drive mad, and then he forced another penalty on himself. And that's part of needing to stay composed in the car and needing to not do that. But I mean, it happens. It
Mm-hmm.
can. So that's kind of my stance. I think it's racing. I think that the penalties, I mean, it's a penalty. It's pretty black and white, deserved. But I think that there's more to the story of why they were given. Like I said, like the one at turn 8 in Mexico, Max is so clearly driving mad because of what happened in 4. And had he stayed more composed and maybe not done that, he could have avoided the second 10-second penalty.
Yeah.
But it's a byproduct of racing. And it's a byproduct of the close margins, and it's, I think, a byproduct of the struggle that we're still having in these cars to pass. So they know that track
Yes.
position in every spot is so critical, and you need to get past your competition, otherwise you're screwed, because clean air is king.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the struggle to pass, because I don't think we talk about this enough.
Mhm.
Like what role the size of the cars has to play
Yeah.
in all of this drama, because we've got the tracks that are the same size, but the cars
Yes.
have gotten bigger and the
Yes.
speeds are higher. You
And they're
know, like
heavier.
the cars are heavier, so it's like these guys are going faster around these
Yes.
tracks. They're doing this wheel to wheel thing with less space. And
Yes.
so, yes, there's going to be contact. Yes, there's going
Yes.
to be drama as a result of it. I, for one, don't think anybody wants a race where it's boring and processional. Nobody
No.
likes Monaco
Nobody
race
wants that.
because nobody passes.
Correct.
Nobody wants any of the other races where, where the amount of passes is incredibly low, because there's no spiciness, there's no
Yeah.
entertainment to it. So, like, careful
And
what you wish for, folks.
yeah, and at what point is it like, this is what you asked for? You wanted more
Yeah.
passing with the regulations. You wanted more wheel to wheel combat. I'll call it. The goal of these regulations was to bring the cars closer together and allow them to race and allow them to do this kind of stuff. And if that shakes out into a spicy on-track battle where, like, somebody gets a track limits penalty or an avoidable contact, or a contact penalty, sorry, causing a collision in NASCAR, you can take the girl out of IndyCar, can't take the IndyCar out of a girl, is called avoidable contact in IndyCar. And then you're mad about these kinds of penalties being awarded or this kind of racing happening. It's like, do you want your cake and eat it too? It's kind of hard to see, knowing that this is the goal of this regulation package, was to bring these cars closer together and
Mhm.
let them race like this rather than these processionals where there's not a pass.
Yeah, exactly. From my standpoint, I mean,
Yeah, I'm curious your take.
I do definitely, I fully agree. Mexico was over the line. The second one more so
Yeah.
than the first.
Yes, I agree.
Completely agree with that point. I thought they were making a example out of
Yes.
Max,
It's like we
which
talked
is
about
why.
before, where teams are going to try and figure out where the line is. And they're going to
Yeah,
try and figure out where the line is on track and off track. And that's, I think, exactly what this was. The stewards are likely trying to set us a precedent, where they've kind of said, it's boys have at it until the point, basically. And this is the point. And
yeah,
that's what it's going to be. And I think that, like, yeah, it sucks it was Max they made an example out of, but, like, I think we said the second one was over the line,
yeah,
and it was warranted that he received the penalty. So I think that too is part of it, and it's not. I hate that people, we're gonna get into stewarding. I hate that people are claiming stewarding bias as well with this, but it's very, like, they're trying to set a driving standard precedent and say, you know what, this has gone on. We've let this kind of stuff and this rough racing happen. We're okay with it to here, and that's the driving standard. That's what we're going to consider acceptable, and then we're going to rule on it based on that. Like, if that's what we're going to rule on, that's as much as we're willing to tolerate.
yeah. And speaking of drama, there was some tech drama as well that
Yeah,
kind of was from Coda, but also was
it kind of
still discussed
tumbled over.
in Mexico around this bib adjuster
Yeah,
that Red Bull has, and there were some displays or demos that the Red Bull
yeah,
team gave about how you have to adjust it. Some claims from McLaren, and I think Toto Wolff also said some things from the Mercedes side around Red Bull making adjustments to the bib device. For anybody that doesn't know, this is the section of the floor, which is the very front section of the floor, sits right underneath the driver's bum there.
yep.
And it's where the air splits to go down either side of the floor.
Right at the start of
And
the plank. T-tray.
yep,
The T-tray is what we'll sometimes
yes.
call that area. If you've ever heard us talk about that, it's that area is the bib.
And I'm glad you mentioned the plank, Molly, because it's a very important part of this.
Yes.
Because the plank is the plank is the Z-10
Yes.
location, and the Z0 is the bottom of the floor or the bib. So
Yep.
the leading edge of the bib. So the plank goes down 10 millimeters
From
to set a wearable surface
right?
that makes contact with the ground, including the front of the plank, which is the one that you always see normally, like when it squats down under heavy braking and then the front starts to scrape and shoot sparks everywhere. That's usually coming from that front bib, the portion of the plank. And we remember at the beginning of this regulation set, there was a lot of the pictures of those little spring devices in the bib that were there. Different teams had different interpretations of how to design that, because it is open for design interpretation.
Yes,
and this is primarily for curb strikes, because the floor and the plank at the very front, the first place you have is that bib right there, will make contact with a curb when you go over a curb. And you need to have some sort of a device in there to absorb that energy.
Yep.
So you've got like a spring and damper kind of arrangement in there.
Yeah.
Now, Red Bull made an adjustable version of this to where they can adjust. Now, other teams can also adjust this. They can adjust the spring and the damper. I believe they have to take the floor off to do it.
Yeah.
And Red Bull designed it to where they don't have to take the floor off. They can do it from the nose cone.
Yes.
Or the drivers.
It's like the little access hatch for pedals, and if they had is it pull rod or push rod that goes through the top this way suspension.
Yeah,
I'm tired and sick.
I can never remember until I go look at a picture.
Yeah, whichever
pull
version.
Rod is up top.
Yeah, pull rod. Whatever McLaren did that was different from everybody.
Yeah.
Pull rod. I think if you had the pull rod, it would also be the access hatch for your suspension, potentially. So it's the access hatch puts down by the driver's feet, essentially, is what Red Bull did. Different from everybody. Which some people claimed bibs were being adjusted while under Parc Fermé, which is allowed.
And so what this would do is what, a lot of people had questions at the time, like, what does it do? So if you can adjust the angle of that leading edge of the bib by any small amount, you could theoretically run the car lower, because what you're doing now is you're giving a curb or something you're going to run over like more of an angular face to contact versus like a straight blunt nose. But this is also very illegal, because the regulations say that the bib, the plank, everything that's attached to it at that Z=0 point has to be at Z=0. So now imagine if you up the angle just a little bit to give yourself a little bit more room for a curb strike, you're no longer at that leading edge at Z=0. You're at some other location that's not 0 point. Push rod is where you've got the rockers at the top. Pull rod is where the rockers are at the bottom.
It'd be your push rod access hatch, stuff like that.
Yeah. So for Red Bull, they demonstrated you have to adjust this by going to the top. And the theory here is, if you can adjust this, you can run your car low during qualifying, where you're on low fuel. And then when you go to high fuel now and the car is squatting lower, you can adjust the bib and you can kind of change the dynamics of the whole thing. So you can optimize the whole thing. But this is highly illegal.
Yes.
Qualifying setup must be race setup. It's in Parc Fermé. The car literally goes into something called a sock, which the car is like wrapped around in this thing. Teams cannot touch it. It's even like there's even like a little thing you have to cut, as far as I know.
There's like a seal, I call it.
To be able to get the sock off in the morning. And I think Callum was mentioning something about this during our last podcast. Shout out. Go check out the podcast with Callum. Last one, if you haven't seen it.
So informative.
Yeah. I think he was mentioning about, for instance, for engine startup, when they can do things because FIA delegates are now around. Same thing after Parc Fermé, the morning of the race. They can't touch the car, take it out of the sock until a delegate's around, and the delegate literally the scrutineer does not leave.
And there's like a designated, you'll see it in garages, the giant clock. That's the countdown time to curfew. And then also, depending on the time of day, is the countdown until they can touch the car and take the cover off the car.
Yeah, there you go.
And here's the thing, if that clock's wrong, you're fucked. You could be. Like, you better hope who's setting that clock is setting it right?
Yeah.
So there's this big countdown clock of their windows that they're allowed to do stuff in. I mean, obviously they can take jokers, they can break curfew and break the seal at that point, but it's not something that they're allowed to do once the sock goes on the car.
Yes, exactly. So all that to just say, it would be very difficult to do this and not
Yeah.
have a scrutineer like go, "What you doing?" You know?
Yeah.
I mean, you're reaching your hands in there into the
With
pedal
like
box and
and
adjusting
actually
things.
quite a long
Yeah.
wrench too. But then we were talking about this and I put my tinfoil hat on and I really don't want to open this can of worms again. But it does look like they're down in the pedal box adjusting the pedals. In theory, they could maybe be doing it because pedals, fun fact, pedals are something that is considered a driver comfort item and are exempt from park permit with approval from the FIA/technical delegates. They could say, hey, Max doesn't like the feel of his pedals. We want to make an adjustment. And like they very well potentially could have approved that because it's driver comfort item, which is allowable under park permit. And they could have gone in there and adjusted it. But I think the demo we saw totally disapproved that that's even it doesn't look like they're
Yeah.
working on pedals.
No, because I mean, like you go in there with some kind of a big long wrench to
Yeah.
adjust something.
There's like a
and
extender on an extender on a ratchet.
And the scrutineer is watching it. Like if you're saying I'm going to adjust the pedals,
Yep. The scrutineer is going to stand over
literally
you.
watching your every move.
Yep.
If you're replacing parts, they're making sure everything is like for like. I mean, it's very
so
tightly regulated.
Heavily watched and heavily observed at that point of the race weekend. There's no way.
Yeah. I just see this as something that Red Bull did
Political.
because, well, there's definitely a political element because there's teams that hate each other.
Yeah. Straight to the drama.
Yeah. But I think that, and as engineers, you know, Molly, I think what we naturally always think of efficiency and anything that I can do to optimize my setup or optimize any changes I need to make without having to do a whole lot of disassembly. If I can now make that adjustment by coming in through the top instead of pulling the floor off and coming from the bottom, I'm going to do it because in free practice, I consider that to be like smart engineering. That's just
I agree.
Optimized
Work
process.
smarter, not harder. Yeah, and it's like, what's the amount of time to drop a floor and change something? That's at least 20 minutes to a half hour.
Yeah.
When
you're losing a lot of time.
Yeah, you're losing a lot of time. So I think it was clever and it freaked a lot of people out. And it's just clever engineering. Like, work smarter, not harder. And they found a way to do that. And it's not like this is really done in the dark because aren't those parts open source too? Like those. Yeah.
Yep.
So like
they're open source parts. Everybody can see them.
Yeah. So like there's no way. Like I just the outrage was I think not warranted for what really it was. And I mean I get it. You see a team doing something that you're competing very close with and you're like, that's not right. It's different from what you're doing. And I get it. But I think the panic and the drama around it was really warranted. Like everybody can see that part. It's open source. It's like scrutineers would have caught it.
Yeah.
Too. So not warranted.
And before we get into the next bit of tech drama, which has to do with humidity in the tires, let's talk about Brazil.
Yeah.
Before we get into that bit, so it was a sprint. It was a sprint weekend.
A lot. Yes.
And there was not a lot of big updates. McLaren did bring a new main plane kind of spoon wing design that had like a little V in it, which was pretty cool. Lots of people were talking about that one.
That was nifty.
Yeah, but McLaren was mega during the sprint qualifying.
Yeah.
What did you think about that? Like, I mean, seeing that kind of like McLaren lockout, where did your mind go? Because I was like, oh, there goes the weekend.
Yeah, pretty much. I was like, what are they cooking? Because I think at one point, like the margin was like 6/10 or something. Like it was a big
6-7 like it was like just dropping.
Humongous gap.
Yeah.
And I was like, what have they figured out in this setup? What have they figured out at this track? Like there goes the weekend. It's gonna be like a papaya rules all weekend. Especially in the wet. And I was like expecting there to be kind of some surprises in the wet. versus kind of McLaren just throwing down these insane laps, at least to start the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite surprised, especially with like the pace in Mexico too, like race pace and stuff. So it was interesting because the race pace was slower, I thought, from the McLarens in Mexico. And then to come to Brazil and just throw these like 6 and 7 tenths gaps on people was crazy. I don't know what you thought.
Yeah, I always considered that like the McLaren would go well in Brazil
Yeah,
because I
so did
just,
I.
because like previous years they had done well even though they didn't have a good car like they have now. And I thought,
Yeah,
and I still subscribe and will die on the hill that like there's something in the car's DNA that just translates from track to track, year to year. It's,
yeah,
the gaps are shrinking for sure. But yeah, that was interesting. And then McLaren's, they locked out the front during qualifying, and then during the sprint race you had
yeah.
the Piastri Norris swap just before the VSC. And before we
Yes.
talk about the VSC, I did want to say
Okay.
something, and I posted this on my X. Piastri, I believe, even though Norris was making comments during the race, I think he wanted to swap earlier.
He did.
And there was some things, about the proximity of other drivers that didn't allow them to swap earlier. But I also believe that Piastri was proving a point
Yes.
because he was in P1. He was leading the sprint race, and he wanted to make it very clear that he is not anybody's number 2 driver.
Yes.
Like
It's payback
he's
for
there.
Hungary, I believe.
Yeah.
The lap times from the point in which Lando was asking for the swap and they began talking about the swap. It was I think it was a statement, but I think we're gonna get into the VSC and the
Let's jump
timing.
into it. Let's talk about it now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll let you lead it off because I have a hot take that may skew the way I talk about this.
Okay, so I have to set this stage and also kind of
Yes.
remind myself along the way. So we had the sprint race. You had the 2 McLarens in the front and the back. Was it Max that was charging up behind them, or was it Charles? Charles ended up being P4 and Max ended
Yeah.
up finishing P3.
P3. So
But
yeah, that's what
I
it
think
was.
you had Stroll who went out, and Stroll was
Yes.
trying to get the car going again.
Yeah.
And then they called. So basically, what they did was they allowed the swap to happen. And
Yep.
then once the swap happened, they then went to the virtual safety car, and the race almost went all the way to the last lap under
Yeah.
the virtual safety car. And so by the time, so they allowed the swap to happen, Max was number 3, or he's in the 3rd position. And then when they released the virtual safety car was right after the last passing opportunity that there was on the
Yeah.
track for Max to try to make a pass. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. The timing of the virtual safety car, because it was
Yes.
quite a bit of time. I think maybe it was 30 or 40 seconds.
30 to 40 seconds, I think it was, versus 1 to 2 given through the rest of the weekend. They were very quick aside from that moment during the rest of the weekend.
And what are your thoughts on that, Molly? I mean, just on the start of the VSC and the end of the VSC.
Yeah, so I have experience of this through IndyCar, where IndyCar's race control, who are like the stewards and who are like the ones that are the ones deciding when the safety car comes out, they're throwing yellows, etc. They've long had a stance that they don't want to influence the results of a race negatively by throwing a caution or throwing a safety car. If they're a caution, you get a car anyway. But they don't want to influence the results of the race too heavily with the caution. So they make every effort to try and let everything play out, and they don't want to try and ruin someone's race by someone being in the pits and they throw a yellow, or if they know that everybody's going to come to the pits or there's something kind of setting up, that they're going to try and let that play out as much as they can. So they'll let everybody come to the pits, and then once everybody's made their pit stop, throw the caution and bring the safety car out. Like, there are instances where they're very quick about it, and there are other instances where they're not. So to me, it seemed like that's what they were doing, and that's where my take might make a lot of people mad that I'm saying that. But I think that this was the FIA trying to let the race play out as much as it could, because there was obviously no imminent life-threatening danger or anything. They have the biometrics on the gloves. They have all of this information about the driver. So it was like a benign spin kind of thing. before they throw the VSC. I think they were trying to do something like that, where they were trying to let the race play out organically and not ruin anybody's race by throwing a VSC when they did, and trying to do that, which I appreciate. But it was a little like, okay, now it's taken too long. Like, there's not anything happening. Really, like, there isn't anything going on. And had they thrown it sooner, they could have had more laps to run. I think that they didn't go about doing it right. Is like, I like that they were trying to do that, because that's what I like about IndyCar race control. But I don't think they went about it the right way. Like, great idea, poor execution, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And they also had, naturally some issues as well during qualifying after the sprint race, where qualifying was very sloppy because it was very wet qualifying.
Yeah.
And you had lots of cars crashing out.
Yes.
They couldn't do qualifying on Saturday because it was too wet. So then they moved qualifying to very early Sunday morning before the race, and it was also very wet Sunday morning. And we didn't want them to have to try to make up new regulations, because apparently they don't have a regulation if you're not able to do qualifying on how they actually start the race.
Which is crazy.
Which is crazy, but there will be for 2025. I think it's like an amendment that's been voted on.
They're going to come in and do it, yeah.
Yeah.
It would make sense.
Exactly. So, but then what happened was, they ended up throwing the red flag.
Yep.
During qualifying in Q2, I believe, on the final hot laps on Q2, and Verstappen ended up not being able to put his fast lap in at the very end because of the red flag. And by the time they had thrown the red flag, there was something like only 40 some odd seconds left.
Yes.
And they just said, not going to restart the session. And so Max was naturally very ticked, because, again, I think it was maybe 30 seconds or something.
Yeah.
Before they decided to throw the red flag.
Yes.
And so more timing of red flag drama.
And I hate to be like, this is another thing that IndyCar does really well. And I talk about this every time this happens in qualifying. Like, if you cause a caution or cause a red flag in qualifying, like cause yellow, you lose your fast lap. There's another layer to the way IndyCar does that with causing issues in qualifying. And if a red flag occurs, and I can go pull the regulation up, or somebody can find it and tell me I'm wrong if I read it out, but the way that I understand the regulation is that all competitors will be guaranteed a 1-lap run if your last fast lap is interrupted by a red flag. I'll pull this up while we continue to talk to find it. But basically, you're guaranteed a lap if something happens during that last lap and your attempt is interrupted. You are guaranteed another try. And that means that, like, they'll come in, they'll clean it up, and then they will let everybody go back out and do one more. So it's chaotic, but it guarantees a fair attempt for everybody, especially when laps get impacted by incidents and red flags in situations like rain, in street courses, where there is a high probability of wrecks. And I think that that's a rule that Formula One would probably really, really benefit from, especially with these late run issues, that then would guarantee people whose laps get interrupted when a wreck happens in front of them in Sector 3 and they lose their attempt, they do get a guaranteed reattempt.
Yeah, which I think you and I were talking about it before we started the episode, but Q2 is the one where Piastri put on the inters when everybody was still on the full wets, and then, went yellow, yellow, and then purple, and then purple, purple, purple. So it was like, then everybody was like, okay, let's put on the inters. Some teams waited to go out because they thought track's going to dry up.
Yes.
And we can, get faster as the session goes on. The downside of that is that if somebody spins out and there's a red flag, you don't have time to get your lap in. So there is a bit of like strategy to it, but I like what you're saying there, Molly. I think everybody should have an ample opportunity to put in a lap and to be able to prove what pace they have.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it for what it is, but it basically is like they stop the clock, and then regardless of the time on the clock, everybody's guaranteed like another attempt, and it makes for a little bit of chaos, but it's something that I think that they do well in that situation where I'm still going to get an attempt. IndyCar regulations. I'm surprised I don't just keep these pulled up at all times at this point. I think I do on my work computer. I want the IndyCar rulebook. I'm just gonna look this up really quick.
But while you're looking that up, I think the other interesting aspect of this is that because the qualifying was on Sunday morning,
Mm-hmm.
you had the instance where there was a few wrecks and teams had to scramble to fix the cars in time to make it to the
Yes.
race. Unfortunately, Alex Albon's accident was quite big,
Yep.
and they were not able to repair his car for him to be able to
Yes.
make it into the race. So unfortunately, he missed the race. So I was not a real big fan of that Sunday morning
Yeah.
qualifying. I feel like, especially in the circumstances where you have a sprint weekend, that
Yeah.
if there's like a big risk, it's raining, it's morning, there's a high chance that people could have
Yeah.
accidents and miss out. Why not just scrap the qualifying and say, oh, look, we're going to take the sprint qualifying results, and that will be then the race, starting
Yes.
positions. And that would have saved a lot of teams damage costs that now hit their cost cap for just trying to qualify to make it into the race in very wet conditions. And then also, poor Alex Albon not being able to have another race that he could actually
Mm-hmm.
start and finish,
Exactly. Yeah,
unfortunately.
I'm looking for this. I agree. I didn't like that, and I come from a series where they do it all in one day. They practice and qualify in one day, and you saw it where Denny Hamlin wrecked in practice at, I think it was practice at Martinsville, and he
Yes.
didn't even get to qualify, and it was like a Herculean effort to try and get the car fixed overnight to try and get it to the race on Sunday. And so
Yeah.
I don't like it. At least I don't think it works for Formula One. The condensed schedule, because of stuff like that happening, you lose the jokers. You lose being allowed to take one of your curfew breaks to do this kind of stuff. And I think that it ultimately did affect Williams' weekend in the fact that Alex couldn't race.
Yeah. And so, it turned out to be an amazing race, actually,
Yeah.
especially for Max, who started in P17 after he failed to qualify or get into Q3, and then and then took the 5-place engine penalty starting in P17 and had an amazing, wow, something is going on with my throat. Let me just take a
Again?
picture. Yeah. Good old Texas tea. Look,
Oh,
that
yeah.
works. And then
I can't
something,
find this regulation.
Max had an amazing first lap, was able to make up a
Yes.
lot of places. I think it was something like 2 or 3 laps. He had made up 7 places. Molly, was this
Yes.
Max's best drive?
I
It
think
was
this
quite impressive and
was.
amazing.
I think this was one of Max's career-defining drives. I think that this is one that people will use for a long time as part of
Yeah.
his legacy in F1. And once he took the lead from Ocon after that red flag with the rain,
Mhm.
I looked up and I'm like 11 seconds in 9 laps or something. Holy crap. He was just putting lap after lap in. And then
Yeah.
I thought it was really funny when GP told him, "No risks, Max,"
Yeah.
because the gap
Chill
was
out,
what? The
basically.
gap was 17 seconds. And he's
Yeah.
telling him no risks, and then is proceeding to talk to him about how, well, if we get a safety car, the gap is so big, you get a free pit stop. What do you want if this
Yeah.
happens? And Max is like, whatever you think, and just purple, purple, purple. He was proving a point, in my opinion. He was like, screw
Yeah.
you, take risks,
Yeah.
and then proceeded to lay down 17 purple laps or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So
I
it
agree.
was
I think it was one of
wild.
his best performances and better than what he had in 2023, where
Yes.
he was coming from the back and in a few of those races, just because he doesn't have the fastest car anymore. Now, granted, I think the car set up in the race in the wet with Max at the wheel was the fastest car
Yeah.
in at Interlagos, but the fact that it was wet made it harder. There was spray. I think you take
Yeah.
all those things into consideration, and I truly think it was one of his best drives ever.
Yeah.
The Alpines as well. I
Oh
know
my
you're a Gasly
gosh.
girl, so
I am.
the Alpines had an amazing showing. Talk to me about the Alpines. How's it feeling watching
Okay.
Gasly get P2?
Yeah, it was so exciting. So I was joking that, of course, they were good in the wet. They're sponsored by Better Water Technology. So, of course, the car's a boat and it works well in the water. But
It's a boat.
it's a boat. That car is awful. They've had actually some encouraging signs since, I would say, the Coda upgrade. they've looked pretty good. So whatever they brought in Coda is working, but it was really exciting. And a lot of people want to shit on Pierre and shit on him, and I'm like, he's such a good rain driver. Like, actually, genuinely, these are like conditions he thrives in, and he's been quietly like dragging a boat of a car around and actually doing pretty good for having a boat.
Been dragging an anchor for a full season.
Yeah, basically. And so this was crazy to listen to play out because I had the onboards on, and it was just like, we're gonna keep you out as long as we can. We think that with the rain increasing, there could be a safety car. Like, you could hear the strategy unfold with them. And I was watching the transcript for Ocon, and it was very like, same thing with Max. GP was asking Max, and they were talking about it too. Like, they wanted to try and keep him out. Essentially, it was what they were talking about was like, how are the tires? And they were thinking with conditions worsening, they're gonna try and keep him out as long as they could in case something happened, essentially. And it played out perfectly. They were literally kind of talking about it like, well, if we don't get a safety car here, here's what I think we're gonna do. And then they wound up going red flag, and they all got their free stop. And it played out perfectly. I was a little worried, actually, because they put Ocon on a set of 3-lap used inters versus Gasly and Max, who were on new inters. And then the next car back was, I think that was George in 4th, who was on 3-lap old inters. Then it was new inters, and then it was mixed, kind of like, I think Lando was on old inters as well. So there was a mix kind of towards the front of cycled inters. And depending on the cycle that those inters have gone through, that's not necessarily ideal for the life of that tire. So I was actually kind of nervous that those were going to fall off and the used inters weren't going to be a good play. But it seemed like, I mean, there's no holding off a Red Bull. But I think the strategy worked out perfectly, and it played into the hands of 2 drivers at Alpine that are very, very comfortable wet weather drivers, and it's conditions that they excel in. It's conditions they grew up racing in the north of France. Like, they excel in these conditions, and it played into strategy's hands and their hands quite well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. No surprise. The northern Frenchmen as well as the Dutchmen know how to drive in the wet.
Yes, correct.
I lived in Germany, very close to both of those places, and it rains a lot around there, for sure.
Yeah. And I think what's crazy is, I think Kern said this on the broadcast, with the jump that Alpine made with this run, it equates to $50 million more in payout with the Constructors' Championship and the way the purse works. So this race was not only massive for them from like a morale boost and for both the drivers and all of that, but this is for the team financially and what they're going to be able to do from an operations standpoint, an investment standpoint, and all of these things when this does pay out if they maintain that 6th place, which, I mean, the points gap's pretty healthy at this point. Like, with 33 points they won or whatever it was. I think that as long as they maintain the 6th, this is humongous for Alpine, outside of just, oh my god, they've had their first double podium since like 2013.
And there's a great listener question we have, so we'll come back to this topic because it relates to exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
It's a really good one. So let's talk about it then. Let's quickly talk about some of the tech drama.
Yeah. Okay.
So Red Bull has accused at least McLaren of using humidity or water moisture.
I may have heard the horse team was also doing it.
Yeah. I didn't say it though.
That's I can't approve. I can't prove or deny it.
Can't confirm or deny.
It's another team I've heard potentially that are also doing it.
There's depending on what you believe of what's been discussed kind of in the paddock. Yeah. Then there's some accusations. Exactly what you hear. There's some paddock talk about one or multiple teams that are potentially using water, moisture in their tires to help with tire preservation.
Yes.
And so we went down a rabbit hole a little bit about this. Molly, do you want to explain sort of what this is and kind of how this works? Okay.
So the first thing I'm going to say is, when everybody thinks about water in tires, this is not like a gallon of water splashing around in the tires.
It's not like filled up with water. No, just splashing around.
That's what a lot of people were thinking. And so what's being alleged is to try and help with tire life, and we're going to get into kind of the science behind this, is that somehow teams are putting water into the tire. And why this is such a big deal is because the the wheels come mounted from Pirelli every weekend, and your assortment is completely randomized. They set the tire on the wheel for you, and that's it. You cannot take it off yourself. It is against regulations. Once it's on, and Pirelli is the only one that can take it off. So that begs the question of how are teams getting water into tires at that point, because you can't take a tire off sneakily like we were talking about the bib device. You cannot unmount and remount a tire, put some water in it without a scrutineer noticing. And so as we were going down the rabbit hole, I think we kind of figured out that maybe it's happening through the valve stem, because teams are allowed to adjust air pressures. Pirelli, if I understand it the way they do it like every other race series in the world, Pirelli is going to give them a working window of tire pressures that teams are allowed to adjust to, that they're allowed to work within. And because of the tire pressure monitoring system, they can see what the teams are running at all times to make sure they're within the window. And through the run, the pressure will come up to where they want it, but they may start lower in a run or higher and go from there. It's to help with handling and the car. And so we were kind of down the rabbit hole of like, well, why does this work? How could they do it? And what we've kind of figured that how it works, and this is actually a very common trick in dirt racing. A lot of dirt racers will do this to help keep their tires cool, is that whatever small amount of water, and so this, we're talking like microparticles, microspray, milliliters. We're talking about a small amount of water, very, very small amount of water, somehow in the tire is offsetting the heating of the air such that it's allowing for a longer tire life. And there's not much of a way to quantify this, but that's basically what it's doing. And a lot of people are like, well, won't the steam build up in the tire? And I'm going to tangent us for a second. Remember that working window. This is the kind of rabbit hole we were down, was like that working window. Our teams that are doing this maybe intentionally starting lower in that allowed window. And as that water phase changes and becomes steam, they're allowing for that in their pressure working window, because they know that that's now going to be present in the tire and it's part of the pressures that they're looking for. They're maybe trying to offset and start a little lower, but within spec. And so I did the math. We were talking about like, well, what does this look like on a tire? And what does this mean if we're thinking it's a trace amount in a tire? The math that I did, and I'm not going to put my actual tire volumes out there because I think that my tire volumes are wrong, just with like, I'm deaf by units a little bit when I converted back out to milliliters. But because we know the size of the wheel, the tire, and everything from Pirelli, it's on their website, Formula One Tires, I went and did some volume math. And from the math that I've done, I would say conservatively it's about 1.5% or less volume of water to air in the tire that teams are doing. But then when you think about it, it's like, well, why water? What does it get you? And that's because water has so much higher of a like specific heat ratio than air does. And basically all that means is water takes so much more energy to heat up. And so we looked this up actually before we started talking. So I was like, I'm actually curious now. It actually takes almost 3,400 times more energy to heat 1 liter of water by the same amount that it takes to heat 1 liter of air. And so by adding water into the tire mixture, it's now taking so much more energy and heat cycling to heat up the carcass and heat the tire, because the water is preventing that, because it takes so much more to heat up than just air, thus preserving tire life.
And so what that does is creates essentially like a heat storage volume for you to be able to then transfer heat from a hot tire carcass into this moisturized gas or gas with liquid in it, moisture, which has a higher specific heat that allows you now to store that energy. On the flip side, the downside of it could be that if you're counting on brake temps potentially to help you heat the carcass of your tire, that could potentially also take longer to happen. But now you're generating heat in a tire in a couple different ways, right? So some teams will try, but the other thing is that also when you get water, so air just by itself is a very good insulator. And the minute that you add water to it, it becomes it has more storage, but it also can conduct more as well.
Yes.
And so you can transfer heat away better with that, but
Yeah.
you can also store it in it as well. So if you can
Yes.
regulate the changes in pressure due to the fact that you have this wet gaseous mixture inside your tire that's now more sensitive to
Yeah.
variations in surrounding temperature as far as pressure goes, then from that standpoint, like, you could actually take a little bit longer to warm your tires up,
Yeah.
but you might be able to also store more heat out of the tire because the tire itself is heating up as it contacts the tarmac.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily require the brakes to heat your tire, but you could just naturally let them come in on their own.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that you would take a little bit more time to find performance on your
Yes.
tires because it would take longer for them to get up to temp,
Be a car
but
for a long run.
they're good for a long run.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I'm not saying that this is just me just going through the mental process, please,
Yeah.
folks.
Oh, same.
Like,
We're still
that
very much down the rabbit hole of this.
yeah. So it's just because this is the way my brain works. And for me, I was always thinking about the times like in Silverstone and other places where when McLaren was really starting to find their pace, it took them a little bit of time to warm their tires up. I don't know if you remember, that was always their thing, is that it
They were
took a
good
little
over a
bit of
long
time
run.
for them to get the tires warmed up. But then once everybody else's tires started degrading or falling off, that's really when, remember, they would always come alive late in the stint.
Yep. And they would go the extra 4, 5, 6 laps on runs, especially in some of the recent races. I'm like, how are they able to go 5 laps longer, 6 laps longer when everybody else is like, oh, they're graining. They're graining. Like, and this is not us alleging anything. This is literally how, like, Obbs and I are like, wait, shit, holy crap. Like,
they were just trying to connect dots.
Yeah,
that's all we're trying
we're
to
dots
do.
Connecting,
like, trying to make it make sense in my head. But
yeah, and
honestly, it could, like, from a technical standpoint, the way you explained it, I mean, all the thermodynamics of it, the energy transfer, everything in life is an energy transfer going from high energy to low energy, no matter what we're talking about.
Yes.
And that whole explanation to me is fascinating.
Yes.
Dirt track racers are geniuses at finding loopholes and ways to get around rules.
Yes.
And so are NASCAR people, because there are a lot of ex-dirt track racers.
Yes. Racing is sport cheating.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about, okay.
Say what you're going to say and then we'll get onto that tangent.
I was just going to say that, everybody wants to try to find the limits and everybody wants to try to find that little edge. Red Bull said this because at one point in time they were either doing this or they were investigating it or doing it, or something.
It was thus outlawed. It is illegal. It's not allowed. I don't know what triggered that. Like you said, either they were doing it or they were looking into doing it. And then, much like teams will do to ask about things, the loophole got closed.
Yeah.
So
and then some
illegal.
People who were at Red Bull who knew how this was being done have moved to other teams now. And they were alleging that those people,
are maybe
were
doing it better.
Yeah. Maybe
so
in a better way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I think it's important with this too that the FIA came out and said that they're going to do all of these checks this weekend now. They checked. Did they check in I think they checked in Mexico as well. Or whatever it was. They checked a previous race.
I've heard that Pirelli has not identified any anomalies.
Correct. Yeah. So they were checking.
And somehow they went back to old races and looked at something.
Well, yeah. Well, they cross-section tires every race, so they would have likely been able to see this, and there would be end of race reports with anything that they observed as tires were coming off, and then they section and quarter whatever number of tires it is after a run every weekend to check carcasses and things. So it would maybe in theory play out there because. And this is where your electroplastics or your electroplastics, Jesus Christ, I'm tired. Your elastomers background,
yes, my elastomers
might come into play. Whereas, like, there's a rule about like certain vulcanized materials and if they can absorb water or not. And if they're looking at grain structure, they would see this. So in the post race checks, there is potentially a way to see this.
There's a lot of really funny things that happen with rubbers or elastomers whenever gas is introduced to them
Okay.
at a higher temperature than normal, and they
Okay.
start to kind of absorb it. And then as the pressures reduce, and then the high pressure gas that's stuck in the rubber tries to come out really fast,
Yeah.
it's called like explosive decompression,
Okay.
and it creates rips and tears in the
Yeah.
elastomer or the rubber. So I'm not sure. I need to think about that to think like,
Yeah.
would there be any signs in the surface of the rubber or the carcass that would indicate
Yeah.
that there was some sort of penetration and then
Mhm.
sudden decompression
Yeah.
as a result of having humidity in the carcass of the
Yeah.
tire? It's an interesting thought exercise. I
Yeah,
need to.
because that's where I was like, if they haven't seen anything, I was like thinking about that too. Is like, well, they section the tires and they're taking them off and they're looking for things. There's going to be checks that they're doing, so there's things that would
Yeah.
give an opportunity to catch that. So far, there's
Nothing
been
yet. So far,
nothing yet. We'll
Yeah.
keep ears and eyes out, but I think it's going to be interesting to see from this point forward if anybody's gonna start to struggle with tire wear, because we saw some high deg in Mexico,
Yeah.
but I don't think that was related to this. I think that was related to the track. But I'm actually really intrigued now when we go to Vegas. Is it going to be a problem? Is it going to be a problem in the last 3 races? Like, who's
Qatar.
going to
Yeah,
start to,
definitely. Yeah.
Qatar is a big one too.
Mm.
Like, who's going to now maybe struggle with tire wear over a long run that maybe hadn't struggled with long run tire wear before? I think
Yeah.
that's going to be a really interesting indicator of if
Yeah.
maybe somebody was running this and something to keep an eye on.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. No, that was a good tech drama
Yeah,
discussion over 2
I
topics
know.
there. We've got some really good listener questions, so I want to get
Yes.
into it as we're kind of rounding
If you've
third and
stuck
heading
with us
towards home.
this far.
Yeah, thank you very much. This
Yes.
first question comes from our Nike.
Yes.
Nick, how did it go unnoticed to the FIA in Brazil that Lando rejoined the track on the restart by overtaking 3 to 4 cars off the track when those cars were actually ahead of him into turn 2? Why was this not penalized or noticed? I think they're referring to the one off track that Lando had in the wet where he kind of went through, I think it was turn 1. He went through
Okay.
turn 1
I
through the
missed
runoff,
this.
and there was like 2 cars that he was even with, and then when he rejoined, he came in right behind Piastri and he jumped
Oh,
like 2 or 3
okay.
cars.
Yeah.
And so the rule, the regulation is that when you leave the track, you're not able to pass
Yeah.
outside of the track limits and gain an advantage, and
Yep.
that's the question. It's because stewarding and regulating a sport is a human ultimately having to do it. Maybe they
Yeah.
missed it in the chaos. I'm not sure. I need to go back and look at it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I totally missed this when I saw this question come out. I'm like, what? Did I miss something? And so I wonder too if he was just instructed or he knew what he did and just gave it back right away. I mean, these
Yeah.
guys know the regulations. I mean, some drivers, like I was talking about earlier, like Max must know these regulations down to the punctuation. But like some drivers know it better than others, and he may have just given it back right away. He knew what he did. So we'll have to go back and look at that because
Yeah.
I was like, huh, I missed something. But yeah, like they like it's hard to miss. It's hard to miss things, especially if it's not an automated like
Yeah.
stewarding system. It's one of those things that's a human element. And here's the other thing though, if like I got away with that, I'm gonna take those 2 places.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I bet you that the other teams were screaming on the radio. Like, there's no way you could have gotten away with it. So I wonder if something was missed and they did it themselves. But we'll have to go back and look at that.
Yeah. So the next question comes from Aiden Dest, which says, does the rain make tire wear less? I'll jump
You
on
can
it
take
since
this.
I love tires.
Take this. You love tires. I was going to say, this is all you.
So the thing about tires is that rain tires have now tread, whereas
Yes.
the slicks have no tread. So when you look at what causes the heating at the surface of a tire, which ultimately leads to rubber degradation and removal, is the fact that you're generating a very high temperature. The mechanical properties of that rubber are changing as the temperature increases, and it
Yes.
now is more susceptible to tearing and breaking as a result of that elevated temperature. Theoretically, if you have a slick tire on a wet surface or a cooler surface, then yes, degradation would be less
Yes.
because your starting point, your boundary point of temperature on the lower track temps or lower track surface temperature is less. So then you need more delta temperature to actually get to that point of degradation, which takes time. Now, rain tires are more complicated because rain tires have tread, which means that there is a standoff from where the base of that tread is, so the valley that channels the water out, and where the portion of the tire is, it's actually in contact with the track surface. The intermediate tire has less of a delta height between the track surface portion of the portion of the tire that's in contact with the track and the portion that is channeling away water. The extreme wet has more, right? So it channels away more water. Now, you get something which is called hysteretic heating in a tire, which is where you take a rubber and then you can do, I used to do this as a kid with a paper clip. Okay. You take a paper clip and you just move a paper clip back and forth like this, right? And as you move a paper clip back and forth, what happens when you touch it? It's hot. So it's generating a lot of heat from the deflection and the deformation.
Yes.
A tire that has tread, like an extreme wet, think about all those little standoff portions of the tire. Those are flexing and moving a lot. So that is going to heat up really fast, which is why intermediates and wets, you see as the track starts to dry up, they'll be going and searching for what wet portions of the track to try to cool the tire down.
Yeah.
Because of that reason, that's one of the reasons why the drivers say that the wet tire you can't actually race on. It's because it has to have so much height to be able to displace the water that now you get this massive movement of the tire itself from the tread with respect to the car, that now it's like I don't know what's the example. It's like trying to walk on jello or something. It's like everything is sort of like out of phase as you're trying to step.
And
if you got that, then kudos to you. Thank you for following along.
I'll put it into like good terms from Brazil. That was actually part of the conversation around strategy in Brazil after the red flag, because of the amount of laps left at the end and the fact that the rain did stop for a period of time and the track did start to dry before the rain picked back up with everybody on their inters. Was, I need you to save these because it's gonna rain again. And that was like part of the conversation around Brazil, was in that latter half of the race, was like, are we gonna make it 30 some laps on these inters with the conditions drying and the rain letting up for part of it before it let back in, and who's going to cook their tires and overheat them because you don't have a lot of water and they're searching for wet that doesn't exist. And so part of that came into play that you were just talking about in Brazil.
Yeah. And so I guess the answer to the question is, it depends. If it continues to rain and then the track is not drying up, then the tire is constantly cooling itself. And actually the drivers are trying to get temperature just to be able to get it to grip. If the track is drying, the opposite, the tires will overheat massively and they will degrade very quickly. So it depends.
All right. Yes, I'll ask our next one. It's from Tech Bite Tips, and it's bite with a Y. Do you think Max will have good pace on dry tracks as well, now that we've seen how good he is in the wet?
I'm just so gun shy right now when it comes to this stuff. I want to believe that yes. So in free practice, I made a comment during the dry run that from the onboard, that this is the best to me that the car has looked handling wise for Max. That it looked much easier, much more compliant for him. I got roasted. I got roasted by people who were
new.
Yeah, by it, who were saying that I'm biased and I'm just sunshine pumping and all this kind of stuff. And then when you had the race in the sprint, and his pace was very strong, the car looked very compliant. When you got to the wet race on the intermediates, the car looked easy to handle and easy to drive because the balance was good. So I think it all starts with the balance. And if you've got good balance in the dry, you've got great balance in the wet, If you've got good balance in the dry, you can find performance. The driver can
Yeah.
attack the corners.
Yep.
So do I think he's going to be good? I'm hopeful that the Coda package has introduced better balance,
Yes.
which allows
I
them to
agree.
find better setup windows. And yes, it
I
should
fully
be
agree.
better.
All right. The next one is from Formula Nerds.
We love Formula Nerds.
Yes. Hello, friend of
Hello,
pod.
friends.
Why wasn't the punishment larger for Mercedes and Lando during the race in Brazil? A smaller fine than that for Charles Leclerc saying a swear word doesn't seem right, as they actually broke technical regulations, sporting regulation rules.
What do you think, Molly?
I was surprised, actually, like very
Yeah.
much so surprised. I can see how the starting procedure infringement was only a fine, as there was some confusion in the way it was worded over the radio and all of that. However, the tire pressures on the grid, that's pretty inexcusable.
That's cut and dry.
And that's pretty big in my opinion. And I was saying to folks, I'm like, that's a slam dunk disqualification.
Mhm.
Like, that's up there with plank wear in terms of like being out of wear and out of weight. Like that's a huge offense.
Yeah.
And so I was shocked that Mercedes was simply fined for doing tire pressures on the grid, because that is a humongous, and I mean humongous, no, especially once you've already come back around after a formation lap. That's like cardinal sin. Like there should have arguably been a heavier penalty there.
And it
I don't know
sets
what you think.
It sets a very dangerous precedent.
It does.
Because when you read the ruling, it was like, well, okay, in this case, because of these extenuating circumstances, it was not possible to follow. Well, everybody else did. So so it was possible. But then the other piece is like, how can you even allow a backdoor to do that? Like to openly admit that like in this circumstance it was okay.
Yeah.
I don't like the optics of, giving a higher fine for a driver swearing than this.
No.
Like, okay, if you want to give him a fine, fine, but don't give him a fine that's less than the one that Charles Leclerc got for swearing. I agree.
Yeah, like this should have been a large sum. Like Charles' penalty, it should have been a larger sum. It should, like, even if you're not going to disqualify because of the extenuating circumstances, this is still one of the worst things that you could do, because it's a huge park for May violation, and it's a huge like in race thing.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. I think it is I fully agree that I think that it makes no sense that penalty is the way that it was.
And this next question is for you, Molly, because it comes back to what you were saying before.
Okay,
you ready?
Yes. All right, yes.
All right. This one comes from Mark Boots, and it says, I'm really happy for Alpine to score a double podium, but does this result open up conversations again to have points awarded to all 20 drivers? A team at the back of the standings for the whole season can undo it in one single race, which is worth tens of millions of dollars. So I think what Mark Boots is saying is that if you award points all the way down to P20, then now even at the lower half of the field or at the lower half of the midfield, people are generating points. And then if you have finishes where you're consistently better than maybe your peers who are down at the bottom, you can accumulate enough points to offset that team having like a career weekend.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, because there's series where they do that and it doesn't really matter at all. Like, you still get a payout. I think it's something that would have to be taken up in the Concord agreement. The teams have all agreed to this. This point structure and this payout structure is part of what they've agreed to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind it because it awards performance. It doesn't award being 107%ed potentially every weekend and hanging out right around the back and still generating millions. I mean, everybody gets a payout based on where they land, but I think it forces teams to still try. Yeah. If that makes sense. Like, I don't mind it. I think it works. IndyCar has what's called the leader circle. It works the same way. They only award down through 11th. I think it works well. and you get payouts that way as a team. If you finish in like this standing or above as a team, you get all of this stuff. And like a great example was, I think it was the Meyer-Shank car. They weren't in. It was one of the cars, or the Juncos car too, with Connor Daly, and then one of the cars with David Malukas that he filled in after Tom Blomqvist was out. The cars, the teams weren't going to get the extra payout, and they put this driver in for 4 races, and they generated points and got in. So I think it works. I think it forces teams to still try every weekend, and maybe that's a hot take and not the take that you expect me to have, but I think it forces teams to still do stuff. Maybe I would like to see a war down to 11th or 12th with how close the midfield has gotten. Maybe just add another 2-point slots, but I think that the scaling of points works. And it works well.
And it's not easy to do what Alpine did.
No, that's
in
the
Brazil.
other thing.
That's it's really difficult to get that kind of result, and if you can get it, you deserve it.
You deserve it. Yeah, I think that it pays what it's worth in terms of the difficulty of the series, and to pull stuff off like that. Like that's like that was humongous. Like they said it was a $50 million weekend on a massive, and I mean hugely courageous strategy call to keep them out like that and to gamble like that. And I think what this shows is teams that aren't in the championship fight, that are trying to preserve their top spot maybe, are willing to take more risks than teams that are up there. So of course Alpine is going to try something. They're ninth in the constructors versus McLaren, who have Ferrari breathing down their neck, and Red Bull again, like they're in this 3-way fight. They're going to want to preserve and protect as many points as they can and try to gain as much as they can and save as many kind of damaging events from happening to them that would prevent a loss of points in a weekend. So they're not willing to maybe take the risk like Alpine. They're not maybe willing to take the risk like Max was and stay out, because they're trying to protect their place in the championship, where teams that have something to fight for and are willing to take that risk are going to.
Yep. Next question from Michael T. Mike T.
All right.
What are your thoughts on the innovative McLaren rear wing in Brazil? I think mentioning the kind of V that's more central than with the spoon wing. Will you see others doing something similar? Also, Red Bull seem to be getting backed. Have they also got more flex in the front wing now like the others? The rear wing is not new. This kind of like collective sort of spoon location for the main plane has been around. I think McLaren was probably one of the ones that maybe chose to put the V so central. So that was maybe a little bit of change. But that's just all like based off of the loading and how you want to define your wing. So I don't think there's anything necessarily like extremely innovative that other teams would want to do.
It looks cool.
Yeah, it looks cool. It was cool to look at.
Yeah.
I do not believe that Red Bull have a flexi front wing, and I do not believe, this is just my take, not because I know anything. This is just my take. I do not believe that they will bring one. They will have an update in Las Vegas, unless something has changed. And I think that most people across the grid in the media that I've talked to believe that the flexi front wings will get tightened up for 2025.
Yeah,
and so this is the last year of it.
Didn't they already crack? There was a TD that came into effect. They were cracking down on policing on it as well, I thought, for this year. Correct? Or am I wrong? There was something they were going to like crack down and investigate, or was that just the rear wing? The rear wings, definitely. Yeah. I think at the start of this year, they did, because even last year, the flap adjusters were flexing a lot, if you remember. Yeah. And they did put a technical directive down on that. Yes. But teams have found other ways to sort of twist the wing. Yes. So what I've heard is just that the FIA will probably tighten this up. They did start front wing checks in Belgium via video. Yes. Yep. That's what I was getting at. Yeah. They're watching them. And then if you saw in Brazil, a lot of the dots, as well as Mexico, they have all the little locator dots on the rear wings as well. So they're certainly watching. They're looking. They're watching. I think that they're letting it ride. Mm-hmm. And 2026, 25 will get cracked down. I think that's why Ferrari brought the front wing they did, because they're like, okay, because it flexes a lot more.
Yeah.
Ferrari's like, you're not gonna crack down on this, and you're just gonna watch for the rest of the year. Fair play. And they brought up a flexi front wing.
Yep. I'm going to skip the next one. We'll go to the last one. So
Yeah.
Richard Tomlinson asked the question, who may
Yes.
know a thing or two about racing
Yes. Hi,
and what
Rich.
goes on in the paddock. Hey, Rich.
I hope you're enjoying your break.
Is it about time that F1 had permanent stewards who are independent from any associations with either the teams or the media or betting institutions, which may lead to more consistent judgments? You want to start, Molly?
Yes. Point blank. Yes. I like your interesting point about the betting thing. I can lose my job if I sport bet. Like, there should not be any type of betting institution. I fully agree that there should be a permanent steward crew. I kind of devil's advocated this, thinking about it, because NASCAR has a permanent crew. It's kind of the same officials. And I still feel like we don't always wind up with the most consistent calls. And also, when you think about who you need to be like a steward and who you want stewarding your race, you need someone with the experience and knowledge to call it. You need someone that knows the series, knows the race, and has a history in it. So, like, for example, Ari Lyondike Sr. is an IndyCar steward. Oriol Servia, I believe, is part of the team sometimes as well, former IndyCar driver. So I fully agree that we need to have permanent stewards. I think you're going to be hard pressed to pull kind of the team affiliation out of it, because you're likely going to look to past drivers, to past team leaderships, like team members. I cannot talk tonight. You're likely going to look to roles and people that have been in roles previously that understand these regulations to the letter of the law, and they know it inside and out. So I think that you would have to screen and kind of choose accordingly your team. But I think it's hard to get away from the team angle for sure with your kind of permanent stewarding selections. And I don't always agree that permanent stewards solve all your problems, but I think it's long time for Formula One to retire kind of the rotating crew and who you're going to get, because it's going to lead to much more consistent group to group, I would say, rulings. It's going to take out the variability of kind of how subjective the rules are, but then you have to be okay with how they're interpreting the rules and understand them. Because one thing about FIA regulations that I've noticed versus a lot of other regulation sets that I've experienced with, there's a lot of really ambiguous language that leaves it very subjective. It is not as cut and dry as some of the other series that I have experienced in regulations with personally. I don't know about you, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that if anything, it can only help.
Yes.
It's worth a try. I think
agree.
there's always going to be the human element that's going to cause us to not always agree with decisions. We live in a very VAR, a video assisted referee world. What doesn't matter on what sport you were a fan of.
No.
But your point around like consistency of the relationship of the people who are doing the review, if these professional stewards are grouped together and they work, together all the time, they're the ones that are doing this, they have a consistency amongst themselves that at least will be present throughout the course of the season. And I think for me, that's the main thing that I'm just mostly frustrated with, is just the inconsistency. It's the thing we just talked about. 10K fine for cursing versus 5K for adjusting pressures on the grid.
Yeah.
It's like,
what?
These are just, and then 20 seconds worth of penalties for Max going, kamikaze dive bomber. And then, no penalty for, I can't remember if it was Lawson hitting Checo or something in the same race.
I mean,
I'm but
sure.
Or maybe he did get a 5 second. I don't know, whatever.
Still,
like these things, they're just inconsistent, and I think that's what rubs people the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think that if you keep the team consistent, and I know that sucks for 24 races a year, having that group that remains consistent together with each other, it'll help the decision making, I think, and the consistency, because you'll know at that point. I always say, like, the IndyCar guys, like, you kind of know what you're gonna get at that point. Like, there's enough precedent, and it's the same guys. You kind of know at that point. So I think it would only help the situation for sure, and I think aid in the decisions. And I feel like lately, as inconsistent as the decisions have been, I feel like they're trying to do a really good job in the document of giving us all of the facts. Like, I feel like the documents, at least lately, have had more information in them, which has been great. And so I think that it'll continue to help, I think, the situation and demystify what goes on in race control if they did it, and it would only help. And this is where I wish F1 was a series where they're not afraid to try it and say, you know, it didn't work, and we'll go back to the rotating steward schedule. But I think it would only help. It's about time that they at least try.
I agree. I think one of the better things that they've done with video assisted refereeing in soccer or football, depending on which country you're in, like in the Premiership, for instance, is that they will share the audio of, you know, the video assisted referees or the people who are looking at it, and the audio
that's cool.
that went into their decision.
That's really cool.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. Like, so if you could do something like that in Formula One, especially when they're deciding in race on a penalty, and you could kind of hear the audio from the stewards room.
That would be cool. Yeah. I think that would be so smart to do, because I think they stopped doing race control transmissions for us as fans over the broadcast. We're no longer allowed to hear that in the wake of, I'm sorry, 2021. But that's something that they stopped, and I don't like that stops. I wish we still got that. So I think it would also help the situation. And you're talking about VAR. I mean, NASCAR automatically officiates during the race on pit road. That algorithm has been taught to make a decision in less than 3 seconds that would take an official in upwards of 30 to 40 and flag it for them to say, hey, there was a potential violation. I actually need you to look at this and make a decision. And it cuts the decision-making time down from 30 seconds to 40 seconds to less than 10 to 15, because it already pulls flags. The official just goes, okay, yeah, confirm. And they press the button, and it rolls down to the team immediately. And then they can converse separately. They will show you on the broadcast exactly what it caught and let you see. It'll show like a big red box where it's like, oh, that tire left the box, and you can just see the algorithm catch it. Or that car drove through too many boxes, and it'll still pull it up and show you 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh yeah, it drove through too many boxes, or there were too many men over the wall. They've taught this virtual system to police things like that for them. And especially the driving through too many boxes thing, I'm like, you could teach that thing to do F1 track limits in a day. And then it would flag it for the stewards. There's no questions asked. All the stewards would have to do is look at it. And I think that the VAR world of sport officiating, it's almost a no-brainer for the motorsport space to be using.
Yeah.
On top of a permanent stewarding crew.
Yeah. We could go on and on. We've been going for over 90 minutes in this episode. It's been a great episode.
It's been a good one, though.
Yeah, it's been a really good one. We covered a lot of topics today.
There's been a lot to talk about, though.
Absolutely. So we've got the 3-week break. So hopefully everybody has a chance to rest a little bit, get recharged before the last 3 races of the year, and especially the teams and the team members and everybody. So
I hope they're all enjoying their time off and having a nice, relaxing break before they have to fly to Vegas, which might be the worst schedule ever.
And you will be in Vegas.
I will be in Vegas. So if anybody wants to say, hey, wants to do some tech content, wants to collab, feel free to hit me up on any of my socials. And I would love to meet up, even just hang out, have a drink. I'm kind of just there to hang out. I don't have much of an agenda unless somebody gives me one. So unless
somebody wants to drop tickets on Molly. Pit passes.
I'm just gonna hang out and have a good time. I went last year, did the same thing, was just kind of there and had a blast. So if you're gonna be there, feel free to reach out. I'll have some Breaking Bias stickers probably, unless I'm out at the club. So I will have stickers. I'll have some
I don't
stuff
even
to
have
say,
one.
hey, you're stateside now.
I'm stateside. We do need.
Yes, I'll send you some. I forgot about that. I thought I sent you some. All right. Tangent aside, yes, I'll be in Vegas, so feel free to say hey. Would love to see y'all. A lot of people weren't in Austin, so would love to socialized some more in Vegas.
Definitely.
But
Definitely.
with that, I think, do you have anything else to add? Otherwise, I'll see us out with an outro.
Yeah, I'm good. Send us
All
off,
right.
Molly.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of the Breaking Bias podcast with myself and Dr. Obbs. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting platforms, and please don't forget to like, rate, review, subscribe to us on those, and make sure you give us a follow over on X, where we are Breaking Bias Pod, as well as Dr. Obbs and my personal pages that are attached to that, where we do basically this, but in Twitter form and tweet form as well. So if you like what we do here, we do a lot more of that over on socials. And then we will catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Minutes.